From Cafe, welcome to Stay Tuned. I'm Preet Bharara.
We tend to favor narcissists. If you look at who becomes a CEO and you compare multiple candidates, the more narcissistic candidate usually gets the job. In elections, too, the relatively higher score on narcissism in an election is more likely to get the votes.
That's Adam Grant, an organizational psychologist and star professor at Wharton Business School. He's also a New York Times bestselling author 3 times over. I speak with him about the qualities of a leader, the pitfalls of charisma, and what makes an organization run well, whether that organization is a company, a district attorney's office, or, say, a presidential administration. This has to be one of my favorite conversations of the past year, and I wanted to bring it back as the year ends. One note, we taped this originally in April, and Adam refers to John Kelly's challenges as chief of staff to Donald Trump. While Kelly's time in that role has come to an end, Adam's wisdom still stands. Maybe the next chief of staff will listen to his suggestions. That's coming up. Stay tuned. As the days get cold and the news heats up, I'm craving routine, sanity, and healthy cooking. Most nights, however, there's just no time to cook. So many indictments to read, so many court transcripts to pore over. It's tempting to get takeout or graze on junk food. But instead, you can knock out a delicious, healthy meal in just 20 minutes with the new quick and easy meal plan from Sunbasket. Sunbasket's meal kits always make it easy and convenient to cook healthy, delicious meals at home, no matter how much experience you have in the kitchen. You get pre-measured, easy-to-prep ingredients and organic produce delivered to your door, now with 10 and 15-minute recipes. Dishes like super-fast Thai turkey lettuce cups or simple sausage tacos with bell pepper, chili salsa, and queso fresco. Sunbasket helps you eat your kind of healthy with options like paleo, gluten-free, lean and clean, vegan, Mediterranean, and more. Extra handy if you have relatives coming into town for the holidays who maybe eat differently than your normal routine. Go to sunbasket.com/Preet today to learn more and get $35 off your first order. That's sunbasket.com/Preet to get $35 off your order today. sunbasket.com/Preet. A new Congress is taking over, and lawmakers promise a full slate of investigations into the Trump administration. Mueller's investigation into the Trump campaign is ongoing. There are inquiries into Trump's businesses and his inaugural committee. The Trump Foundation has been shuttered in response to charges brought by the New York Attorney General. The news is not going to stop, nor are we. That's why we launched Cafe Insider, to help make sense of what's happening in the country. And we're bringing you more real-time, in-depth analysis in the form of new podcasts, a weekly newsletter, text alerts, and more. On the Cafe Insider podcast, Ann Milgram and I take stock of what's happening as we process the latest headlines. To listen to the Insider podcast and experience the rest of Cafe Insider, become a member at cafe.com/insider. That's cafe.com/insider. Adam Grant, Professor Adam Grant, thanks for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me, Preet.
So you're a professor at
Guilty.
At Wharton, at the University of Pennsylvania. And is it true that you're the best professor at Wharton?
Oh, that would not be my place to judge, would it?
But you have gotten a lot of accolades from students as being a great teacher, so I'm not going to embarrass you with all of that. But it's an important thing, teaching, and I don't think we spend enough time focusing on it. So you are a professor of what?
I'm an organizational psychologist, so I teach management and leadership and collaboration and organizational behavior.
Why were you drawn to psychology?
You know, I think like most people, it's largely because I've had too many awkward interactions in my life.
You mean when you were a kid?
Yeah, growing up, I was always the kid who got dropped by my friends, and so, at some point I got really curious about why, but I guess as I moved through every part of my life, there was a role that psychology played. So in high school and college, I was a springboard diver, and I was kind of riveted by the challenge of motivating myself to leap into the air and do somersaults and twists, and know I was probably going to crash land. And then I had to talk other divers into doing that when I became a coach. And one of the things that was always striking to me as a diver was how many times I would go up in the air and think I'd done a pretty good dive, and then pop out of the water, and my coach would say, "Adam, that was bad."
And so does that goes to lack of self-awareness?
Yeah, I mean, when you're somersaulting and twisting, it's really hard to know exactly where you are and, to feel whether your entry is perfectly straight or, whether you're a little bit turned sideways. And I think that's so true in our work lives, that sadly, most of the time we can't see our performance objectively. And so, I guess in the same way that I would sit down and watch videotapes of my dives, to see what my coach was seeing, I think we need other people to hold up a mirror so that we can see ourselves more clearly at work.
But let's take a step back and have you explain to folks, aside from teaching at Wharton, you go into companies and into other organizations to help them. Explain what that part of your life is like and why you do that.
So I guess it ends up being, sometimes research, sometimes consulting. So, when I do a research project, there's something that I want to understand. And so I might go into a company like Google and design an experiment to figure out, can we make their jobs more meaningful and motivating? Or, can we help make their teams more effective? And then, in a consulting project, sometimes I'll get called by ranging from, the Gates Foundation to an investment bank with the question about, how do we do a better job attracting and retaining people or improving our culture? And so, I often come in as sort of a generalist in the sense that I don't know anything about the industry. But I've spent a lot of time studying the common challenges around people and culture. And so we try to bring evidence to the table to solve the problem.
So you're like a one-man McKinsey?
Well, I'm kind of the guy who gets hired after 3 consultants have been fired.
You're like the cleanup guy.
Yeah, it's like, hey, you know what? This has all failed. We might as well try an academic before we give up entirely.
And why do you do this kind of work? Do you enjoy it in a different way from other work?
Yeah, I guess in some ways my job is to fix other people's jobs and, broken organizations. And what I love about it is most of us spend the majority of our waking hours at work. And yet we end up stuck in dysfunctional workplaces all the time. And so I feel like if there's something we can do to drive change, it's a way to have a positive impact on lots of people at once, as opposed to, just trying to tackle one job at a time.
I talk about culture and used to talk about culture in organizations all the time, but I don't have the benefit of a degree in organizational psychology or in anything other than government and the law. Talk about what it means for there to be a good culture at a place. Is that a real thing, or is that something, boneheads like me just like to say because it sounds nice?
No, I think it's real. So, when I think about culture, I think about repeated patterns of behavior, that reveal norms and values. I think one of the shorthand ways to capture it is culture is what people do when no one's watching.
Right. How does a bad culture form in the first place? Who's responsible for it?
Well, oftentimes, not surprisingly, cultures turn out to be reflections of the founder or of the leader who's in charge. So, that happens in a few ways. One is that, that founders and leaders very deliberately try to create certain cultures, right? So they create them through the behaviors they reward and the behaviors they punish. But they also create them in ways that they're not aware of,
right?
Through, actions that they take that send clear messages. So, I've worked with a whole bunch of organizations that have had a similar challenge, which is you walk in and there's this incredibly cutthroat, sort of ruthless set of norms where people are constantly undermining each other. And you ask, well, how did the organization get this way? And the answer more often than not is the CEO basically promoted a bunch of people who maximize individual results and only measured, what does your personal performance look like? And there was no attention paid whatsoever to, gosh, what's the impact of your performance on other people?
On the team, right? I remember reading a study once when I was thinking about how to promote people in my own office when I was a U.S. attorney and what kind of teams made sense. I remember thinking, there are people who are geniuses and who can be amazing at their job, whether it's, making widgets or giving a speech or trying a case. And you think that they're indispensable. And so you can't do anything about them because they're the best person that you have, but they're otherwise toxic. And that you have to assess whether or not the entire team will do better without that superstar than it would do with the superstar, as opposed to thinking about retaining the superstar because that person is so productive. Does that make any sense?
It does. And the reality is that, that even stars are substitutable, right? It's just harder to measure the impact that, that a toxic superstar has. do you measure, how people feel differently about their jobs as a function of that person being there? Maybe. But how do you quantify that? And that's something that, that people have a hard time doing. And yet, if you look at the data, it's pretty clear. One bad apple can spoil a barrel, but one good egg just does not make a dozen.
Right. Well, that's I'm going to write that down. You should put that in. You should put it in.
I don't know what that means, but maybe you do. So, if we were to break down what toxic behavior looks like, I've often studied this on an axis of giving to taking. So, the givers are people who are always asking, what can I do for you? The takers have the opposite stance. It's all about, what can you do for me?
Is it sometimes possible to make the toxic person on a team better? Because we've been talking about how, you throw away the bad apple or get rid of the bad apple, the toxic person, even if they're an overperformer individually. But can those people be reformed? Do you have any stories of success when you've gone into a company or an organization and helped the person who was just taking and ruining the overall productivity of a team and making that person see the light and become better?
I don't think that's the most common reaction.
Oh, really?
So, oftentimes when people are, when they've adopted a pattern of taking behavior, it's either because, they've decided that's the way to be effective. And, then you have to work really hard to show them that, in fact, this behavior is undermining their success, or they're just completely unaware of it. And then, you have a real self-awareness challenge there.
But what you're saying is is mildly depressing. Are you saying that that organizations of a certain size are always fixable because you can change the teams and you can alter structures and systems, but there are certain people sometimes at places who are not fixable and not redeemable, and you got to get rid of them?
Well, I think, look, if there are different kinds of takers, right? So, there are narcissists. There are people who have gotten burned too many times and, decided that they're going to have to be, more selfish in order to get ahead. And then there are psychopaths. And I don't think that, you're going to have a lot of luck reforming a psychopath. Right. Let's put it that way. But,
what if the psychopath is the head of the organization?
I would leave immediately.
But what do you?
Another one.
But so you get hired, let's say, to take a look at a company or a government agency or a White House, for example, and let's say the determination is hypothetically that the head of the organization, who is not changeable because it's a family company, or they're elected, or some other reason that they're installed for some permanent period of time going forward. Can you make those organizations better if the head of the organization is either a narcissist or a psychopath?
I think you can. I don't think it's easy, right? So, I think the depressing part of this story is that it is much easier to change culture by removing people than it is to change those people's behavior, especially if those are powerful people.
What kind of leaders are the best personality type? Have you discovered over time that there's a certain kind of prototype personality, introvert, extrovert, confident, self-doubting to some degree, or does it vary? There are different kinds of superstar leaders depending on the place.
We've been studying leadership and personality for decades, and it's very rarely true that there's any one trait that defines a great leader. So there are traits that define bad leaders. And I think it's pretty easy to make the list of, okay, it's better to be a giver than a taker. As one example, it's if you look at other dimensions of leadership, it's better to be long-term focused than short-term focused. No surprise there. It's better to see a lot of potential in your people than to assume that they're stupid and incompetent. I think that one of the sort of the big ahas that comes out of my field is, great leadership is less about the traits you have, and it's much more about how you use them, which is a question of adaptability and saying, all right, I might want to show my emotions a little bit in one situation because I need other people to be concerned.
Right.
And I might want to, sort of keep them in check in another situation because I need other people to be calm and focused. Yeah, I think there's a fun way to look at this that often sort of that turns out to be revealing. We normally talk about optimism and pessimism in this realm, and I want to modify that a little bit and say it's really useful to know if you're more of a strategic optimist or a defensive pessimist.
I don't know. Which one am I?
I don't know. We're going to find out. You ready?
Yes, please.
So take me back to law school.
Yes.
And about a week before you had a major exam,
Why do we have?
what was your emotional experience like?
Well, I think I've evolved a lot since law school, but I'll go with the experiment. A week before the exam, the first major exam, I was probably terrified, nervous. I wanted to be a successful lawyer, and I was thinking ahead to what career I might have, and so I thought this test was incredibly important. Grades, I felt, were more important in law school than in college. So I was a total stress case.
Sweet. And now?
Well, I don't take legal exams anymore. So, I've been
before a big trial or a big speech or a lecture.
So now I feel like I've had a career, got fired from only one job, and I no longer think that any particular thing I do would be ruinous. I feel a lot of stress about new things. So, frankly, I'll tell you, I was a lawyer and still am a lawyer, and things that are involved with the law, I feel great comfort in attacking. But I started this podcast a few months ago, and I was very nervous about it and didn't want it to fail, and it easily could have, I guess, because it was new and I'd never done it before. So new things like that, I probably had a significant amount of stress and worry that you'd fail at an entire enterprise. But if you're talking about legal things, probably, given that I've lived a long while and I'm 25 years out of law school, I no longer thought that, any particular thing would be my Waterloo. And so I probably was okay with it. And, I developed some confidence in knowing that certain things I could do fairly well. So by the time, I tried, a number of cases, I was no longer terrified of trying a case. I had that feeling that people say you're supposed to have, the nervousness and a little bit of anxiety you have before a race, knowing that you're a decent runner.
Yep. Good. We can run with this.
Okay.
So,
also,
by the way,
I'm a Libra. All right, but I'm very curious. My parents are going to be listening to this very carefully.
Oh, perfect. So, let's see. If you were a strategic optimist, far on that end of the spectrum, about a week before that big law school exam, you would be envisioning a perfect outcome. And then, that image would motivate you to study really hard, and you'd be excited about the test, and then, you'd ace it.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a defensive pessimist, which I think you're more of, at least, by default, about a week beforehand, you wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. The other thing I'll say is law is one of the only known professions where defensive pessimists consistently outperform strategic optimists. Tell me if you agree with this. My sense of really excellent trial lawyers is that, it may look like they're playing to win, but a huge amount of their preparation was playing not to lose.
Correct. No, I agree with that. I agree with that. I want to talk about, institutions and how leaders of institutions are supposed to get the best information to make decisions. We spend a lot of time in the show talking about a lot of things and how, if you're a Secretary of State or you're Secretary of Homeland Security or a president, how you do the right thing and how you make sure that the information flow works in such a way that good decisions are made. And so if you'd indulge me in asking a question that I don't mean to be political in any way at all and or partisan in any way, but lots of folks, who are Republicans or Democrats observe, how our country is led. And they look at a White House and there's lots of discussion about whether or not, John Kelly, the chief of staff, is doing what he's supposed to be doing, and is discipline being enforced in the White House. And at some periods people think it is and some people think it's not. And, famously, the Clinton White House was not particularly disciplined, and Leanne Panetta and I talked about that in the very first episode of this program.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit, again, not about the politics of it, but how you imagine in a universe that is the West Wing of the White House, how things should be run, what your observations are based on your research and the data, and how people can do a good job serving the country in that place?
Well, let's start with the data. One of the best ways to guarantee that you make disastrous decisions is to end up in a pattern of groupthink.
Of groupthink, yes.
Yeah, where we're basically everybody is essentially marching in the same direction, and nobody ever questions each other. If you look at what actually causes groupthink in 4 decades of careful research, one is overconfidence. When a group is too convinced that they already know the answer and they have all the right skills and perspectives they need to solve the problem. And then the other is basically politics, that people are worried about hurting their image, and so they don't speak truth to power.
So how do you speak truth to power? So let's say you were working in the White House, not you, but someone is working in the White House.
Yeah.
And you think that the country's on the wrong course on something, whether it's the border or whether it's Syria or whether it's trade or anything else. And in good faith, you think that both the country and the president would be better served doing X instead of Y, given the environment that you imagine exists and given your research and your experience. You're sort of a mid-level staffer at the White House. Let's say you're more, you're a serious advisor. How are you supposed to get your point across in a way that doesn't get you fired, but that gets aired?
Well, one of the most overlooked strategies for influence is asking for advice. So, I think normally when we're trying to speak truth to power, we think the more forcefully we argue, the more we're going to be heard.
No, that's off-putting. As the head of an
Totally,
institution, when
right?
someone
People
came to
get
my office and said, "Preet, if you don't do that, that's crazy. That's idiotic. That's stupid," and I'm gonna lose my mind. That's not effective, even if it's true.
Who are you to tell me what to do? Right? Don't give me orders. I'm in charge here.
Right.
So, very often asking questions works much better than giving answers.
So what's an example of that in this context?
So an example would be, let's say I'm an advisor and, I'm worried that there's a decision that's going in the wrong direction. What I might do is I'd go to John Kelly and I'd say, "Hey, John, I'd really love your advice." Actually, I'd probably say, "Hey, General Kelly, I'd really love your advice." So General Kelly, I really love your advice. I think we need to be going in a slightly different direction on trade. I've got a bunch of data to back that up. And I know you're really good at getting heard around here. What recommendations do you have for me?
And then what should John Kelly do in that circumstance? So he gets the request to give advice, but knows that the principle is set on, the principle of the organization, I guess in this case the president, is bent on doing a particular thing on trade, tariffs of a particular nature. And he thinks that's fine, but he wants, other points of view to be aired. How does John Kelly in a well-functioning work environment get that done?
So I think he's got three options. The first one is to do the same thing and ask the president for advice. So, I might go to President Trump and say, "Look, hey, Mr. President, one of the things that I've always admired about you is your flexibility, that you don't get locked into one kind of decision. And, I think there might be a direction we ought to consider on trade that other people around the room, might be a little more rigid on. You're so open. How would you get them to be more open?"
That's based on flattery. Flattery plays a big role, I guess, in institute. I had no idea. By the way,
everyone has an ego, right?
Yes, they do.
Then the second option would be to try to address it structurally. So what I would do is I would go into a meeting and say, "Look, lots of White Houses have been embarrassed and vilified for making decisions that seemed good in the moment, but with the benefit of history and hindsight, have been really bad. And we want to be so much smarter than those people. So, let's learn from those mistakes." And one systematic mistake was there wasn't an honest broker. This is Roger Porter's research.
Right.
That when everybody who's the head of an agency has direct access to the president, it's really easy to tilt the president's views. And what you want is a chief of staff or, someone like that who sits above those people and communicates with a filter. Ideally, with an eye toward what's good for the country as opposed to what's good for my agency or for my political agenda. And so, let's create that structure to avoid, what all those idiots have done before. that I guess would be a second option.
You'll be careful about that one, right?
Very careful.
Right.
And then the third would just be to think about norms, to say, "Hey, Mr. President, people respect you enough in this White House that, once they know your opinion, they're all going to defer to it. And, I know that you know how important it is to have a good, healthy debate and discussion about different options. So why don't we have the leader speak last? We'll go around the room, we'll get everybody's opinion, and then you can weigh in. And then, you have all the knowledge on the table that you need to make a decision."
Yeah, that's something that I learned late in the process. I think I read an article about somebody, and I noticed it in my own office, that if we were deciding to take a course of action on a case, and it was always a discussion. We sat around the coffee table in my office, and if I made known the way I was leaning, but I was totally open-minded, but I had to lean in a particular direction because
everybody else leans too.
They start leaning, or they don't make the argument in the way that they might have made it. And I saw this, a couple of times, and it was very sort of jarring to me because, I'm a pretty easygoing guy. But institutionally, you're still the person in charge. And I would see a shift in the expressions of people, and I would see they wouldn't advocate for the contrary view quite as sharply as they might have otherwise. Because people, one time is okay to be on the other side of what the boss wants to do. The second time is not great. But nobody wants to be on the wrong side of the ultimate decision 3, 4, 5 times, because then they think their advice is going to be, not respected because they always get it wrong, when that was not at all what I was trying to get across or the culture I was trying to create. And then you learn over time to keep your mouth shut totally and hear from other people first. But it took me several years to learn that.
It's a huge problem. And, I think that I have watched so many leaders, struggle with this in the sense that they think they're communicating openness. And they don't realize that the more power you gain, the more worried everyone else is about challenging you, criticizing you, disappointing you, or just, kind of looking like they're not on the same page as you.
So tell me, Adam, if I'm in a meeting and I want to, and everyone's sort of agreeing that we should do A versus B, but I want to have the benefit of the argument for the other side, what I would do sometimes is I would call on someone and I would say, why don't you make the case to do the opposite? Why is that not effective?
Well, look, I think that almost every leader I know says, all right, we got to get the devil's advocate in here. And it's a great idea with one tiny wrinkle. It doesn't work. There's a psychologist at Berkeley, Sheryl Sandberg, who has spent her whole career studying this. And what she finds is that devil's advocates rarely convince anyone of anything. And more often, they actually backfire, and they leave the group more convinced of the majority preference or where the consensus already was. And that happens for 2 reasons that we know of. One is that they don't argue forcefully enough.
Their heart's not in it.
Yeah, exactly. And they don't have enough time to prepare usually as well. And then the other side of it is that the rest of the room knows that they're just playing a role, and so they don't take it seriously enough. It's like, hey, we checked that box. Now we can go right back to what we already wanted to do.
Okay, so how do you solve that problem? How do you get the devil's advocate position despite the problem?
Solution that's easy in theory but hard in practice is to say, instead of assigning a devil's advocate, you want to unearth a devil's advocate. Find the genuine dissenter who actually holds a different viewpoint and give that person a voice and invite them into the conversation. And then when you hear that person's voice, you are significantly more likely to make a good decision and also to reach a creative solution to the problem that hasn't yet been considered.
In that regard, then, it would seem to me, just looking from the outside as a private citizen, that the White House seems to have, genuine contrarian thinkers. And there are schools of thought that develop, right? Some people want to do X on trade. Some people want to do Y. Some people want to bomb Syria. Some people want to wait. So should we be, happy that there are differences of opinion strongly held and likely not, just made up, but true contrarians in the decision-making process, so that, whether you like the decision or not, depending on what you think about things as a citizen, that there's meaningful debate going on in the White House?
Yeah, we should be happy, but I think the open question, at least for me, which maybe you can weigh in on, is how much are those contrarian opinions being heard?
Right.
And, how often are people biting their tongues?
So let me put it this way. Everything that you study deals with rationality and is backed up by data. And there are environments where, some things are not going well, and that's why you get brought in. And then there are environments, not just people, but there are environments that are toxic. And everything that I read about this White House, and this may have been true of other White Houses too, of the other party, but everything you read about this White House is that it's toxic and that people are afraid of being fired at any moment or upsetting the president or being on the wrong side of an issue. And there's worries about leaks, and that advice, honest advice being given, is immediately going to find its way into the Washington Post or the New York Times. How do you deal with an environment, and what's your advice to people in an environment that is so messed up by all reports?
Well, if that's what it's like, I say good luck.
You can't say that. That's not what you're supposed to say.
No, I mean, look.
This is our country. This is our country, Adam.
This is not easy. Look, if I had a solution, I would certainly be offering it. Let's start with this. So let's say, there's a sense that, there's some senior people who are defensive, and this would not be the first White House where that would be the case, right?
Right.
So you could look at that as a fixed personality trait, and then you're basically stuck with it. Or you could say, look, actually what personality really is a set of tendencies. And, we all have kind of a baseline that we orbit around, but we fluctuate from day to day. And there, even the most defensive person there are moments when they're a little bit more open.
Mm-hmm.
And your job is to observe the fluctuations and figure out what the patterns are.
So a little bit of the fault, if I may say, lies in the strategies that are being utilized by the people around the president, right? I mean, the president, look, he's the president. People have to get over it. And, some people hope he goes and some people hope he gets reelected. But he's the president. And if there are people of good faith in that environment, you take him as he comes, and he's not so changeable because he's lived a long life and he's been successful being the way he is.
Yeah.
The people around him, as you say, have to find their opportunities to steer the decision-making in a particular direction. And so I guess my next question is, what are the personality traits of the people you want around a president like that?
I mean, my favorite experiment on this showed that if you just say 19 words before criticizing someone, they become about 40% more open to the negative feedback. And the words are roughly, I'm giving you these comments because I have high expectations of you, and I'm confident you can reach them.
Right. So you're saying John Kelly, in trying to suggest an alternative course on something, should say to the president, I believe in you, Mr. President. I believe in the course you're setting for the country. And I have absolute faith that we're doing the right thing overall. But you know what? We shouldn't bomb Syria quite yet. And you think that has a greater likelihood of success?
I think it's worth a try. I would probably phrase it a little bit differently. I'd probably articulate it by saying, Mr. President, you have a track record of making some really creative decisions. And, you've taken bold steps where other people were afraid to act. And I think that's a big factor behind your success. There are also times when, that can be the wrong move.
Right.
Trump stakes. And so, let's take a step back and figure out, is this decision more like one of the good ones or one of the bad ones?
Right. I mean, the problem here, it seems to me, that's hard to get around, is that you have a guy who became president of the United States who was told repeatedly, you can't win if you act the way you do, if you tweet the way you do, if you treat people the way you do, and they were all wrong, and he won. And so, he's lived a long life, and he got to where he got by being the way he is. And so when rational, reasonable people, generals or otherwise, or subject matter experts, tell him things that he doesn't like and say, you can't do X or Y, he thinks to himself, and it's not crazy to me what his mental process must be. He thinks to himself, you're just like those other people who told me not to do this, and you were all wrong. And so I know better, and I'm the president, and so go to hell.
Yeah, I think
react to that, because it's not.
Well, there are a couple of ways that resonates. The first one is that's actually how learning works, right? So if you go all the way back to Pavlovian conditioning, remember Pavlov training his dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell? We're all susceptible to classical conditioning. So if the president repeatedly is told you're not going to win or you are wrong, and he rejects that advice or viewpoint, and then ends up learning that he's correct over and over again, pretty soon he's conditioned to believe that whenever somebody says this is a bad idea, it's actually a good idea.
Right. So how do you fix that?
Actually, before we talk about how to fix it, there's another piece of it, which is our brains end up filtering information, kind of censoring the bad stuff the same way that a dictator would censor the press. And so over time, right, what you can do is you end up in a confirmation bias mode of remembering the times when people said you were wrong and you were right, and forgetting the times when they said you were wrong and you were actually wrong.
Oh, I totally do that.
We all do that.
Are people changeable? I just took for granted this idea that if you're a 70-something-year-old who got to where you got as the president, that the people around you have to adapt to that person. Have you seen experiences in your life where people actually are able to be changed, whether it's at the head of a company or the head of the government?
Yeah, I think they're few and far between, right? So we change relative to our baseline. But there are some pretty radical examples of people changing in pretty radical ways. So one of the ones that comes to mind from history is a guy named Alfred, who one day woke up and saw his own obituary in the newspaper. And it said, "The merchant of death is dead." So he made dynamite and his obituary said they'd called him the Merchant of Death. And he had originally made it to try to make, mining more efficient and maybe a little safer. And, it had, of course, this destructive effect in a lot of ways. And I think it was his brother who had died, and the newspaper mixed him up, and it got printed across I think a whole country, maybe even across an ocean. And so he had a chance to look at his legacy, and he didn't like what he saw. And so Alfred devoted the rest of his life to trying to do good. His last name was Nobel. He created the Nobel Prizes.
Oh, that guy.
Yeah, that guy. Too often we're looking at our lives through a microscope. And what we actually need is a wide-angle lens where we can zoom out and ask, what is my legacy? What is the impact of this behavior on my reputation? And, sometimes with the right information, people do not like the person that's staring them in the mirror, and they decide they want to change.
Right. You travel far and wide. You talk to a lot of people. From time to time, you talk to me. What are some ideas, or what's an idea that has you excited for the future and that might make people's lives better?
Oh, there's so many. I'll tell you what I'm excited about right now that's relevant to our conversation.
Okay.
So there's some really cool research that's been done on American companies and also Chinese companies looking at the most effective leaders. And I was thrilled to see that if you look at narcissistic leaders versus humble leaders, the humble leaders are more effective. They're rated as better, their employees are more productive and innovative as well. And, when you think about what a humble leader brings to the table, it's, willing to admit when you're wrong, trying to learn from your mistakes, always wanting to improve. That's good for you as a leader, and it's also motivating and contagious to your people who tend to adopt some of those qualities. So that's all good news. There's also the other.
I'm sorry. Was that surprising? Like you sound very elated.
Yeah, it was surprising.
That was a result. Why would that be so surprising?
It was surprising because we tend to favor narcissists. If you look at who becomes a CEO and you compare multiple candidates, the more narcissistic candidate usually gets the job. And we see it in elections too. The relatively higher score on narcissism in an election is more likely to get the votes.
Does narcissism bear any relationship to what people call charisma or not?
Yeah, it can. So if you look at studies of American presidents throughout history, the narcissists do tend to be more charismatic.
But is charisma overrated as a quality in leadership?
There are very few things as a social scientist that I would say for sure, but that's a for sure.
So why are we so focused on charisma? Because people, I guess the storybook says you have a charismatic leader in civil rights or in industry or something else, or in politics, and they inspire people through their charisma and charm and oratory and passion, and so people follow them.
Yeah.
And that's how you get something done. Is that overstated?
Well, I think, look, that is, you just beautifully summarized what we know about the benefits of charisma, which is it's inspiring. People are more willing to follow you. They're more motivated to follow you. But good leadership is about more than just inspiration. Right.
You have to execute. Right.
Yeah, it's about strategy. It's about execution. It's about good decision making. It's about resolving conflicts. And very often, charisma becomes a crutch. That when leaders are highly charismatic, they're actually less likely to develop good operational skills and really focus on the details. Mm-hmm. And so it sort of impedes their development, which is a problem if you have to work directly with these people.
Right. Well, there's also in politics, I think, there's a danger of charisma. Because there's sometimes a fine line between tremendous charisma and demagoguery. And so people can be led and can be manipulated by the charismatic leader or the cult of personality, which is something we always have to be worried about. And maybe it's different in business, but...
No, it's not actually. There's research on two kinds of charisma. So there's socialized charisma, which is about, hey, I'm going to get you inspired about the mission of this organization. And then there's personalized charisma, which is I'm going to get you inspired to be loyal to me. And the former is powerful and the latter is incredibly dangerous.
Professor, I could talk to you for many more hours. I'd love to have you back because I need a lot more examination of myself by someone as smart and I will say appropriately charismatic as you. Really a pleasure having you on the show.
Delighted to be here, Preet. Thanks for having me.
Well, that's it for this episode of Stay Tuned. Thanks again to my guest, organizational psychologist and best-selling author Adam Grant. If you like the show, rate and review it on Apple Podcasts. Every positive review helps new listeners find the show. Send me your questions about news and politics. Tweet them to me at Preet Bharara with the hashtag AskPreet. Or give me a call at 669-247-7338. That's 669-24-PREET. Or you can send an email to staytuned@cafe.com. Stay Tuned is presented by Cafe. It's produced by the team at Pineapple Street Media, Kat Aaron, Chris Berube, Henry Malofsky, Jenna Weiss-Berman, Joel Lovell, and Max Linsky. Our music is by Andrew Dost. And special thanks to Julia Doyle, Jeff Eisenman, and Jake McAbee. I'm Preet Bharara. Stay tuned.